Gavin, if you reported somebody who you thought was a threat to society for whatever reason, not knowing that they had a weapon, presumably the police could connect the dots and say, well, maybe we should seek a court order because that person has the following weapons in their possession.
Hello and welcome to the next episode of Beneath the Law. Today we're going to talk about a fairly, I think, remarkable topic in terms of law and regulation, which is something that is quite dramatic and very impactful, frankly, on society, particularly Canadian society, American society, and that is gun control. And what is the role of government in controlling guns and firearms? And it's been a subject of hot debate, obviously. There's all sorts of people on both sides of the equation. We've all heard the mantra from those on the pro-gun side saying guns don't kill people, people kill people. And I always like to add in at the end, yeah, with guns. So, guns are a mechanism that have been devised, frankly, for the purpose of killing or injuring people. They're a weapon. They've been designed as a weapon, they've been produced as a weapon, and they've got pretty efficient over the years. Today, we're very fortunate to have with us a member of Parliament, Yvan. Maybe you could tell us which riding you're in. I can't recall, but with the Government of Canada, and a real advocate, and who has a real background in this area, Yvan Baker. Yvan, welcome to Beneath the Law, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Kevin. It's great to be here with you guys. And I represent the riding of Etobicoke Centre, so a suburban community in the western side of the city of Toronto.
Wonderful. So, Yvan, maybe you can give us some background on the role that your government has played in trying to deal with this balance, I suppose, between gun control, which is absolute prohibition, no one can have guns, and sort of walking that line where there are potentially legitimate uses for firearms, as opposed to the, quite tragic and horrific illegitimate uses for firearms that we see in the news every day.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, I think we, in my time, I've been a member of Parliament, of the federal Parliament, for about 4 years, and I distinctly remember knocking on doors in the last two elections, and especially in the 2019 election, and people were talking to me about gun control all the time. It might have been, it was one of the number one issues for people in my community. And so that, Canada's traditionally had more restrictive gun laws than those in the United States, as your listeners would probably well know. But there was really a desire, certainly from folks in my community, I think folks from coast to coast to coast, for us to take stronger action to prevent some of the more serious gun crimes that we've seen in our country, and to sort of anticipate and prevent the kinds of violent crime that we've seen south of the border and perhaps other places in the world. So there's a few things that we've done recently, and there are a number of measures through several pieces of legislation, but I would highlight a couple. One is, so back in the spring of 2020, that we announced that we would ban about 1,500 models of assault-style firearms. So some people call these are assault style. That's the technical name, I think, but there's some people call them military style weapons. So we just basically banned their sale, use, transfer, etc. in Canada. And then the other thing we did in the spring of 2022, or the summer of 2022, I'm sorry, is we banned the importation of handguns, and we introduced a law called Bill C-21, which basically the ban in the summer of 2022 was done through regulation, through the executive power of the government. But Bill C-21 would enshrine this in law. That bill is currently in the Senate, and the bill does a number of things. One of them is it enshrines that ban on the importation of handguns, but it does a few other things that I'll flag. One is it brings in what we call red flag or yellow flag laws. So what these would do is a red flag law would basically mean that it would, right now what happens if you want to own a handgun, there's a number of steps you have to take. You take a course, you have to get a license, and you have to register the weapon. Those are the big three steps that I think about. And as part of that process, there are background checks to make sure there's checks for mental health, criminal activity in the past, et cetera. And people can be prevented from getting a license as a result of that. The red flag and the yellow flag laws would basically allow people in subsequent to a person receiving a license or owning a gun, for people, citizens, anybody, to raise a flag, if you will, to report that they have concerns about that person owning a gun, either because they believe that there's a mental health problem, because they're involved in criminal activity, because they're involved in trafficking guns. There's a whole series of things. So the goal of that is to make sure that we're not just checking for the suitability of someone to carry a gun or own a gun when they apply for the license, or every 5 years when they renew the license, but in the intervening period, it allows citizens to report in and raise concerns if there's somebody who they believe could be a threat to society. So these are some of the things that we've done more recently.
So we currently, Yvonne, in Canada, if someone has a mental illness and they report that to the police, do the police have any power right now to go in and seize a gun from someone? Or do they have to get a court order? I mean, that's usually what I understand the yellow flag or red flag law in the United States is all about, that you actually need a court order.
Yeah. Like, to my knowledge, Stephen, right now, there aren't, it would have to be, to my knowledge right now, it's very difficult to do that. Like, it's pretty difficult to remove the gun from someone based on a perceived threat. Certainly if they've committed a crime, if they've been convicted of a crime, certainly those sorts of things are permitted. Or if, there's something that's concrete in the context of mental health, to my understanding, the police can obtain a court order, but these interventions are relatively rare, from my knowledge. The red flag and the yellow flag laws that are currently in Bill C-21, which, like I said, is still working its way through the Senate, if that were brought into place, would make it a lot easier for people to raise these flags, to get those court orders, and get the police to remove the guns from that individual.
How would someone know, Yvonne, just in terms of the mental illness and in terms of the fact that someone is applying, for example? I think there's two parts to that, as I understand it. Number one is someone who's applying for a license would give people the opportunity to object to that person having a gun. But what about somebody who already has one? Is there any ability, and what notice would people have, for example, that so-and-so, my neighbor down the street or whatever, who's acting strangely or has threatened people, number one, has A, applied for a license, or B, already has a weapon?
Yeah, and that's a good question, right? It's hard to report somebody if you don't know that they have a weapon, right? So I mean, you would have to know, somebody would have to know that the person has a weapon, and under this red flag or yellow flag process. I would imagine, I'm not, I would imagine that what would happen is, assuming Bill C-21 passes and you have these red and yellow flag laws in place, you may have circumstances where people suspect that someone has a gun, or doesn't even suspect someone has a gun, but is concerned about their danger to society in some other way. I would hope that because in Canada, if you legally own a weapon, you have a license and your weapon is registered, then the police would be aware that that person has a weapon. So, Gavin, if you reported somebody who you thought was a threat to society for whatever reason, not knowing that they had a weapon, presumably the police could connect the dots and say, well, maybe we should seek a court order because that person has the following weapons in their possession. So that's how I would see that rolling out. But obviously the devil's in the details on the execution of that.
Well, and that was a real issue, Yvonne, in the shooting in Lewiston, where the state of Maine actually has a yellow flag law, and the individual involved there, Robert Card, who killed 18 people, half of them basically at a bowling alley and half of them at a restaurant, had been reported by, I think, the military for mental illness, and he had been 2 weeks in a mental hospital, I think, in New York, being assessed. And there were a number of other reports with respect to him, and the yellow flag law failed, that no one seemed to have taken any action to go in and seize his weapons. And he used assault-style or military-style rifles in his assault, and I believe both of those rifles are banned here under the legislation that was passed back in 2020.
Yeah. So on the latter point, yeah, I agree, Steve. So on the latter point, yes, I agree that those, from what I know of the weapons that he used, those assault-style weapons are banned here in Canada. So you can't use them, you can't transfer them, you can't own them, etc. In terms of your question around how it would work, yeah, I mean, I think you're raising a really good point, right? I mean, I'm not an expert on the U.S. flag laws, so I won't but I do think that, so I don't know if there was a gap there in the law or a gap in execution or both in that case. In our case, I think your point is well taken, though. I think at the end of the day, you can have all the laws in the books you want. If the mechanisms aren't in place, the people aren't in place, the resources, the IT systems, all of that stuff, the courts don't have the capacity, all of that isn't working together effectively, then you won't be able to execute those red or yellow flag laws. But the goal here is to really make sure that if somebody, and we'll have to make sure that the proper resources are put into policing, but also this doesn't just touch the federal government, right? Policing happens at the provincial and municipal levels too, so we'll all have to work together on this. But I think broadly speaking, the goal here is that, like right now, if you think about it, what happens is a person who purchases a firearm legally gets a license. That license has to be renewed every 5 years. Right now, there really isn't a check in the intervening period, right? So when you go back to get your license, there'll be a background check, and people will check, does this person have a history of mental health problems? Are they a threat to society in some way? Right now, that check happens only every 5 years. But then the risk there is, of course, that something develops in the intervening 5 years and nobody catches it. And so the idea here is that we create a system where society can, at any point in time in that 5-year period, flag. The police will be given the powers to obtain the relevant, orders, or the court can issue an order which would allow the police to then seize the weapons or suspend the license or whatever the case may be, depending on the circumstances. So the goal here is really to prevent the kinds of things that we've seen where someone who's wasn't a threat or wasn't a perceived threat when they got the license and has become a perceived threat, whether it's because of mental health or other reasons, that's something that we can intervene and do something about it. But the people who have to do something about it, the courts, the police, et cetera, have to all be working together. And as you say, Stephen, that can break down. So we've got to work hard to make sure that system's in place and working well.
Yeah, and I think another important aspect, just to fill in the listener in terms of our gun control laws in Canada, is that there's a 28-day minimum waiting period with respect to applying for a handgun. I'm not sure if that applies to a rifle or not, but certainly there's that minimum 28-day waiting period when you make your application after taking your course and passing your test.
Yeah, that's right. I believe, I'm not an expert on the waiting periods, so I don't want to misspeak on this one, but you're right, Stephen. I think it's at around that 20 days sounds right. And then there's a waiting period to obtain the license and for the registration as well. So, these waiting periods I think are useful in the sense that someone who's trying to legally purchase a weapon needs to go through these steps, and there's sort of a cooling off period, if you will. So if there is somebody who intends to do something illegal with the weapon, and they're planning to do it with a legally obtained weapon, and by purchase a weapon, they have to wait some time before they pass through all the steps.
Yeah, you know what? That's really my it keeps ringing in my ears all the time when I hear it. And first of all, I want to say I'm not a gun owner. I'm not gun aficionado at all. I don't really see the purpose of them in any way, shape, or form. But what's always troubling to me is I wonder if there's statistics that are out there to show the percentage of gun crime that is undertaken with legal firearms. I mean, firearms that have been obtained through all of this process. I mean, what there is this rigorous process to legally obtain a firearm, and firearms that have been, obtained just because we have this huge undefended border with probably the largest arsenal of guns ever known to humanity just south of us. That is relatively porous. I mean, the fact is that I don't know how many cars a day come across the border, but we're not searching the trunk of every one of them. And I'm assuming that there's a lot of illegal handguns, for example, coming across the border. And my own thought is, there's a legal way to obtain guns and there's an illegal way to obtain guns. And I guess if you obtain guns illegally, then you're what they call a criminal. So the criminals have the guns. And is it effective in Canada, or are handgun bans? Are we really, are we tilting at windmills here?
That's a great question. Well, I think they are effective. I think what we've seen is that, like the stats, to answer your initial question, Gavin, on sort of the number, the percentage of gun crimes committed by legal versus illegally obtained guns, right? I mean, the share of crime, of gun-related crime that's committed with illegally obtained guns continues to increase as a percentage of the total, right? So when we say illegally obtained guns, what we're basically mean in most of these cases is they got smuggled across the U.S. border in some way because they're not really manufactured in Canada, right? So the guns in general if they're going to end up in Canada and they're going to be sold illegally in Canada, then they were probably smuggled across the U.S. border in most cases, or stolen from somebody who was a legal gun owner. And there's a whole bunch of provisions that make that less and less likely, more and more difficult. So I think what that signifies is that, we've probably done it, I think, in Canada over the course of years, right? Like, we've done a better job of sort of regulating legally owned guns and trying to prevent those from being used in the commission of a crime. I think the next frontier now, Bill C-21 still has to get passed, right? So that's the bill we were talking about with the red flag and the yellow flag laws and the handgun ban. So that's not done. But when that is done and properly, and the execution's put into effect, like we talked about, I think the next frontier is that we really need to prioritize is the smuggling of guns into Canada, right? There's so many. I think it's in the city of Toronto from a few years ago. The city of Toronto police, I think, indicated that I think it was 86% of gun-related crimes were committed by an illegally obtained handgun. So if we're serious about dealing with gun crime, then we got to deal with that smuggling. So there's a number of things that the government has done. It's not like we're focused on the legal guns and left the smugglers to do their thing. It's very much we've been trying to do both. But the smuggling is a harder problem to solve for a bunch of reasons, right? Like we've got a long border with the U.S. It's porous. Like you say, we can't check every car or inspect every car. So there's been a few things that and there's parts of the border that are really hard to monitor, right? Where there aren't checkpoints and that sort of thing. So there's a few things the government has done. More sophisticated technology at the checkpoint, so you can more easily scan and search a truck or a vehicle coming through, that sort of stuff. So there's that element of it. We've put a lot more resources into monitoring the border where there aren't those, monitored checkpoints. So that's, these are border patrol and that sort of thing. But we got to do more there to make sure that we're addressing the flow of guns across the border. I think one of the things that the limitations on legally owned handguns that we talked about earlier in this conversation have done or will do is that they make obtaining a gun illegally more expensive, right? Like, if you make it harder and harder for criminals to obtain guns legally and they've got to obtain them illegally, that's going to be, the supply is reduced, right, of guns. And so that makes it harder and more expensive. So hopefully through that, we're actually helping to reduce the number of guns that can be used in the commission of crime. But we got a lot of work to do on the smuggling guns into Canada.
Well, we certainly, Yvonne, we have challenges here in Canada. As Gavin says, we're north of a country that has probably the highest percentage of gun ownership in the world, private ownership of handguns and all kinds of weapons, shotguns, rifles, assault weapons, etc. And I guess one of the other challenges now that we are facing is what are called ghost guns, where people are basically, using a 3D printer or something else to make their own guns that are not even registered anywhere. So I don't know how we deal with that challenge, where people are basically going somewhere and making their own handgun.
Yeah. So we have put, I believe it's in Bill C-21, Stephen, I believe. But we have put, whether through regulation or through Bill C-21, I think C-21, we have put some restrictions on the types on the types of guns you're talking about, the ghost guns. That's really, really dangerous, right? Like, for folks at home, that basically just means, like, with a 3D printer effectively, or some version of that technology, people can basically make themselves a gun. And so it's fine to stop the smuggling and limit the sale of weapons, but if people can manufacture them, at home, basically, then we've got, we're not really solving the problem. So I think your point is well taken. We have put restrictions in on people's ability to do that. There are some limitations. It's not a complete ban in any context. There's restrictions on that, and I could probably, after the fact, send you some information on that. But we're trying to address that issue as well.
Does Bill C-21 also, one of the things always, I've always found of interest is, it's banning guns is one thing. What about ammunition? How do these, criminals and whatnot, they may be able to get a gun, or there must be smuggling over ammunition to feed those weapons as well. Is that covered by the legislation?
Yeah, that's a good question, Gavin. I believe it is. I'm not gonna. I don't want to misspeak here, Gavin, on this one. I believe the ammunition is covered, certainly for the weapons that are banned. So I talked about the assault style rifles and the handguns, but but I'd have to get back to you on the specifics of that.
Because that would seem to me that if you choke the ammunition point, then even all the illegal guns will just have nothing to shoot, which would probably be pretty helpful.
Yeah,
except that you'd be making your own bullets.
That's right. That's right.
Get your 3D printer out.
Yeah, that's right.
But they'd be plastic, right? So they wouldn't be so bad.
Oh, I hope you're right. I think my understanding is the ammunition is also banned, but I think from a practical standpoint, it's easier to replicate, as Stephen was alluding to, and it's a lot easier to smuggle, ammunition than it is guns. So I think it's I believe it's easier for us to prevent the smuggling and the sale of handguns, but the ammunition is, I think, part of that as well. So it's a good question, Gavin. We should be tackling it on all ends. I believe we are, but I'd have to get back to you on the specifics of that.
Can you comment, Yvan, on the interprovincial relationship here? Because my understanding, or interprovincial relationships, I guess maybe in general here, because part of, I think, the spring bill in 2020 that banned these 1,500 models of guns was a buyback program, and right now the buyback program doesn't really take effect until 2025. But Saskatchewan passed a piece of legislation which was, I don't know, I'm going to call it a little bit weird, requiring police and the RCMP to actually apply for a provincial license in order to buy back guns.
Yeah. So what I would say is that to my understanding you guys are the lawyers, right? But to my understanding from a legislator's perspective is that, there's a lot of coordination that has to happen with the provinces on this. And whether that's legislatively or in terms of execution, like we talked about earlier, right? Or policing and law enforcement, et cetera. And the courts and all of that. So this issue that you're raising in Saskatchewan, I'm not fully appraised on the sort of the legal implications or any restrictions on this legislation, but here's my take on it. At the end of the day, my understanding is the federal law. We need to be working with the government of Saskatchewan and others to make sure that this law comes into force. I don't know whether the law in Saskatchewan you're talking about could cause any kind of delays, because there's a process there that presumably one would have to go through. And I don't know about sort of the jurisdictional legal issues. But I'm pretty confident as a legislator who worked on Bill C-21, I can tell you that, I'm pretty confident that the federal government has the jurisdiction and to implement this. But that's not to say there aren't considerations like this that we're going to have to work with provinces to overcome. But at the end of the day, I think I'm pretty confident.
Saskatchewan flexing its muscles and saying, these are property rights, and we want to have our input into it, and just tell you that we're out there and we're watching this.
It could be that. It could be that. And I think, so it could be that. So we have to, at the end of the day, I think I'm pretty confident that we can implement the law Bill C-21 as we talked about, and we have the legal right to do that. But that doesn't mean that steps like what you talked about in Saskatchewan aren't things we're going to have to overcome or work through. Hopefully we can work through and discuss and sort out so that it doesn't get in the way of what we're trying to achieve with Bill C-21. But yeah, point taken. We have to work to overcome that as well if it's going to be a barrier.
Just one last thing before, this is completely different from the topic that we've been talking about. Well, not completely different, but partially different. It's a different angle from a legal perspective. We've been talking about regulation and laws that make the possession of firearms illegal, or make it difficult or onerous to obtain them, which is helpful. But there's another side to the law, obviously, which is the tort side of law, and that is the ability to sue a manufacturer of a product that is inherently dangerous. I mean, we can think of all sorts of product liability cases over the years where manufacturers of products that have caused harm or injury to individuals have been subject to mass torts, for example, litigation in the U.S. Now, the right to bear arms is more than a constitutional mantra in the United States. It seems to be almost religious to some. And there are legislative exceptions and protections for civil liability of gun manufacturers in the U.S. Those aren't here. We don't have those in Canada. Has there been any thought to a mass tort approach to gun manufacturers, to weapons manufacturers, ammunition manufacturers, to pick up on my point, in regards to the fact that they've made a product that is inherently dangerous and injures people, and therefore would be open to liability.
So are you saying provide them with more protections or provide them with fewer protections?
No, I'm saying they don't have that. In the U.S., they have protection from civil liability, as I understand it. And they have immunity in regards to being sued for tort, for production of what is inherently a dangerous product. By definition, a gun is a dangerous product. That's what it's made to be dangerous. But that doesn't exist in Canada. So I'm just there, as far as I know, there has never been a class action, for example, against a gun manufacturer in Canada by the victims of gun crime or people injured by guns. And I'm saying, is that something that would necessarily? I mean, if these are businesses that are in business to make money, and if you hurt them on their bottom line and on their balance sheet, that makes it difficult to make the product. Is there any thought given to exploring a mass tort type approach?
Mm. So I haven't been part of those discussions, Gavin. So I guess the answer is, as far as I know, there hasn't been. But I'm fully in favor of exploring that too. Like, I think at the end of the day, as you say, the folks who are manufacturing these guns are manufacturing a weapon that kills, and they have a responsibility to bear as well, alongside obviously the individual who's committing the crime. So I agree with you.
I think. Sorry, Yvan. I think, Gavin, you make a very good point, and it's an interesting question. And I'm not aware, certainly, of any immunity for gun manufacturers. And if I recall, and I could be wrong, and Gavin, you're going to help me here with respect to the law, but I think the cigarette manufacturers were actually held responsible for or potentially paying amounts of money for causing cancer, right? And all of that changed as well with respect to the way that the product is advertised, and federal regulation came in with respect to what a cigarette manufacturer needed to include within a pack of cigarettes, and all kinds of warnings. In the United States, I know that there are some cases, there are very few cases, but gun manufacturers have been sued in the United States for the mass shootings. And I think it was the Sandy Hook shooting, or maybe it was the one of the other mass shootings, but a settlement was reached where I think it was Remington paid something in the neighborhood of $70 million to the families of and I guess any people who were injured, surviving victims there. So certainly, I don't know of any Canadian case yet where a gun manufacturer has been sued, but it's certainly a potential avenue of redress for someone who is injured in a gun-related crime. To look at going after a gun manufacturer, particularly where guns now have technology where you can have palm prints or fingerprints embedded into a gun, so that someone who does personally buy a handgun, they're the only people who can use that handgun.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're talking about was really interesting because mass tort litigation, as much as is decried to some extent, it does modify behaviors. And it does modify marketing in the sense of who these products are marketed to. And guns, just to my mind, and as I say, I'm not a gun aficionado or an expert in any way, shape, or form, but there are guns and there are guns. I mean, I would assume that there's a different type of firearm used for skeet shooting, for example, than there is for a machine gun that's got one purpose that I can think of. And if you're manufacturing something for a specific purpose or use, and you market it in that way, and then it is used in that way, and it injures people, I mean, that's mass tort litigation all over the place. That's product liability all over the place. And that's what we talk about when we talk about cigarette manufacturers and all sorts of other products that have been injured people over the years. And maybe that is the way to go here in Canada. If, obviously the regulatory approach is one that we are pursuing, but I don't know that that's ever been pursued by government or otherwise.
Yeah, I don't know, Gavin. I do think your point at the beginning is really important for your listeners, though, I think, which is that, look, we don't have those, there's no protection of the gun manufacturers here in Canada, right? So we're not protecting them from that sort of legal action. But the pursuit of legal action is interesting. I mean, obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, but most of, there's very little, from what I know, there's very little manufacturing that, if any, that happens in Canada around guns, right? Like most of the manufacturing is in the U.S. And so even the guns that are sold legally in Canada are imported into Canada. And so that's why, going back to the earlier part of our conversation, the banning of the importation of handguns is so significant because, there isn't really a domestic manufacturing sector here for guns in Canada. So if you're not manufacturing domestically, which we're not, and you're not importing them legally, then the only guns that can get in, the new guns, are those that are smuggled, right? So going back to your point, so I don't know, you gentlemen are the lawyers. I wonder if there's some cross-border issues or jurisdictional issues that have led to people not pursuing this because the manufacturers are, domiciled in the U.S. I don't know if that's a factor. That's something that you guys would be able to opine on more than I. But I think at the end of the day, yeah, I'm with you. I think that, and Stephen, your point about the cigarette manufacturers is I think, there are differences, but it's helpful to think of that circumstance or that history, and to think about, how we tried to hold cigarette manufacturers responsible for the damage that they caused to people's health. And so, in a similar way, I think guns have caused a lot of harm to people, and we need to be holding them accountable. So, but I think our focus in Canada has not been so much on that. It's been more on, at least from a government perspective, it's been much more on how do we limit the importation? How do we limit the sale of weapons that are dangerous? I'm not talking about hunting rifles and those sorts of things. Those sorts of things can be owned and used safely, but trying to minimize the harm to people of that. And now we got to deal with the smuggling as well.
Excellent. Well, Yvan, I think we're going to have to end it there. That was a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your insights on the regulatory framework here in Canada and how we're trying to improve things as we carry on, both in terms of regulation of ownership and acquisition of firearms in Canada, hopefully for the public good and to prevent or limit to some extent the harm that these products cause people. And perhaps there is something there to pursue down the road from a tort perspective. Maybe we'll put our thinking caps on in that regard. Anyways, to our listeners, thank you so much once again for joining us on Beneath the Law, Stephen. Always a pleasure to spend a little time chatting with you. And if you download this podcast somewhere, please rate us. It's really appreciated, whether it's good or bad, hopefully good. And that gives us some indication of where we should be going, or if we're doing something right, keep on doing it. So once again, thanks for joining us. And always remember that if no one is above the law, then everyone is beneath it.